Hush, little baby, don't be sad. You'll grow up to be like Dad. Hush, little baby, don't you cry, just because your dad was the Fly.
What's up, everyone? Today we'll be discussing The Fly 2, the 1989 sequel to David Cronenberg's masterpiece, The Fly. I actually saw this in a theater back in the day, and for many years I avoided rewatching it. Let's just say there's a few insanely gory parts that got under my skin, and there's some surprisingly emotional moments, but we'll get to all that in a bit. Upon its release, The Fly 2 had a decent box office run, but it received mostly negative reviews. However, as the years have gone by, I've noticed some love for it online, so I figured, let me revisit it, and we'll see how well it holds up. As always, spoilers are ahead.
It's getting worse.
I'm getting better.
Stepping in to direct this time out was Chris Wallace. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because Chris is the special effects artist who worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark, Gremlins, and the original Fly, for which he won an Academy Award. So Wallace was a solid choice. He was obviously very familiar with the material. One of the best things The Fly 2 has going for it is the story. This isn't just a rehash of Cronenberg's original. Sure, there are familiar elements such as the returning telepods, but we explore some fresh territory as well. And there's a sense of anticipation throughout. It's the same vibe as watching a Universal monster movie. We know there's some monster action ahead, but the journey to get there is also a key ingredient. Months after the events of The Fly, Veronica Quaife in labor and things aren't going well. You may or may not notice Veronica has been recast and is played here by Saffron Henderson. According to the director's commentary, Geena Davis was asked to return, but she declined, stating that the birth scene from the original was more than enough for her to deal with emotionally the first time around. But check it out, Stathis is back, as played by John Getz, and he's actually the only actor to return from the original movie. You may recall Stathis spent most of the previous movie as Veronica's antagonistic ex-boyfriend, but at the end he did help Veronica escape the clutches of Brundlefly, though he did lose a few limbs in the process. On that note, this story is kickstarted with some more gross imagery. Veronica gives birth to Seth's child, which initially appears in a horrific larval sac. Soon after, Veronica dies from complications, and it's revealed the baby is seemingly normal. But we all know that's not the case because then the tagline wouldn't make any sense. Martin Brundle is an interesting character. He has dormant mutant chromosomes inherited from dear old dad, his life cycle is highly accelerated, he's a genius, and he doesn't even need to sleep. So the setup is clearly in place for a monster to emerge. It's not a matter of if it will happen, but when. Another major player in this story is Anton Bartok, as portrayed very well by Lee Richardson. Anton is the owner of the company that financed Seth's teleportation experiments. Initially, it does feel like he's going to be a typical evil corporate leader type, and to be honest, that's not far off. But there's more to it than that. Richardson doesn't play Anton as a one-dimensional villain. There's nuance to his performance. Mr. Bartok adopts young Martin and pretty much plays the part of a very questionable father figure. I also enjoyed the setting in The Fly 2. The Bartok facility is very claustrophobic, and that's fitting for this dark story. Martin grows up in a confined laboratory/daycare center. And I don't care how many cool gadgets this kid builds. His life of constant observation, tests, and being poked by needles just seems awful. And the abuse he takes from the Bartok staff is evident throughout this entire movie. The first glimmer of hope we see from Martin is when he befriends a golden retriever. But this bleak movie is fully intent on removing any and all traces of happiness from the equation. Martin soon finds out his new best friend is the latest test subject in Bartok's experiments. An attempt to teleport Martin's dog fails, and the poor animal is left horribly deformed. Animals in these movies just don't have any luck, but this seems to be the worst yet. A few years later, we meet a 5-year-old Martin, now played by Eric Stoltz, whose body and mind has matured to that of someone in their early 20s. So, I guess you could say Martin ages about as fast as the kids from Stranger Things. Kidding. Just kidding.
What?
Anyway, Eric Stoltz is best known for his roles in The Mask, Some Kind of Wonderful, and Pulp Fiction. Obviously, Jeff Goldblum was a tough act to follow, but I think Stoltz holds his own and delivers a unique performance. He's an orphan child destined to mutate into a fly. We can't help but root for him. As a birthday gift, Martin gets his own little home, which of course is still on Bartok property. Now the whole point here is that he finally has his privacy and isn't being watched, right? No more being watched? Yeah, I think you see where this is going. Anton urges Martin to take over his father's work and nudges him along by providing him with some of his father's records. And it's here that we get a nice little cameo from Jeff Goldblum. Interestingly, this was just archive footage from the original movie, but it works surprisingly well in context. And it's always cool to see Jeff Goldblum back. You'll recall earlier I mentioned the emotional moments in this movie. Well, brace yourself because Martin eventually discovers that his dog has been kept alive in secret. This of course is horrible on multiple levels. For starters, Martin was specifically told by Anton that the dog was euthanized, yet here he is alive and suffering. Martin is forced to euthanize the dog himself to put him out of his misery. Again, this whole subplot was just brutal. Now, if there's one thing all fly movies do need, aside from body horror and monsters, is some kind of tragic love story. The love interest here is fellow employee Beth Logan, as played by Daphne Zuniga. Horror fans may know of Daphne from the 1982 slasher The Dorm That Dripped Blood, and 1984's The Initiation. I was mostly familiar with her from the 1987 Star Wars parody, Spaceballs.
Son of a bitch!
And that's actually how she landed this role. Both Fly movies were produced by comedy legend Mel Brooks, and he suggested that Daphne play Beth Logan. The relationship between Martin and Beth is given a decent amount of screen time. We see them struggle to get the telepods up and running, which is a backdrop for their growing romance. After Martin successfully manages to transport a kitten without turning it into some kind of abomination, that seals the deal. Martin and Beth hook up. Because as we all know, nothing gets the juices flowing like transporting animals around in telepods. Martin's success with his father's telepods is good timing, because he's finally showing signs of metamorphosis. He even has a mysterious festering wound, and he just refuses to stop picking at it. Stop it. He hopes to cure himself, but the only way to do so is to swap out his mutant genes for healthy human genes. However, that would be a nightmare for the donor of the healthy genes. The final act of The Fly 2 is easily the strongest. Martin catches on that Bartok has in fact been watching him on hidden cameras. And this whole thing is just creepy as hell. In hindsight, it isn't really a surprise. We get enough hints throughout the entire movie that nothing about Bartok Industries is on the level. Mr. Bartok confirms he's been eagerly awaiting Martin's mutation. As it turns out, Martin is the prototype for a new age of biological exploration, and the restored telepods are going to help Bartok Industries become immensely powerful. Now, some of this does feel a bit like Saturday morning villainy.
What?
But what grounds everything is the personal relationships. Martin saw Mr. Bartok as a father, and there's no coming back from this betrayal. We also get a great scene of Martin's escape from the Bartok lab, and we finally see him kick some ass, as his insect genes begin to awaken. One surprising highlight is when Martin and Beth visit Stathis for help while on the run from Bartok. This whole bit serves as a very nice connection to the first movie. Stathis is a drunken, grumpy, eccentric weirdo, and it's just fun to watch. As I mentioned earlier, this movie is pretty bleak, so it's interesting that Stathis of all people serves as the comic relief.
Where's your compassion?
I had to give it up. It cost me an arm and a leg.
Martin's transformation is very different than his father's. Instead of a slow and dramatic change, Martin's is much quicker and seems a lot more like an evolution.
My body is growing stronger.
Eventually, Martin becomes enveloped in a cocoon and is brought back to Bartok Industries. And in no time, the fully transformed Martin emerges in the form of an awesome fly hybrid. And with this, the epic rampage begins. For fans of practical effects such as myself, this entire sequence alone makes this well worth a watch. I really enjoyed this updated take on The Fly. The movement is fluid and its face is very expressive. And he seems to have mastered the fine art of acid puking. Wallace and his special effects team did an awesome job showing us the creature in action too. The animatronics and puppetry on display are all very impressive. On a director's commentary, it's mentioned that yes, this may be just a rubber monster, but it's a great rubber monster. And I agree with that 100%. There's just something about well-executed practical effects that tends to hold up over time. Another one of my favorite moments was when Martin comes in contact with a guard dog. Now, we're not exactly sure how this is going to turn out, so the scene is filled with tension. But Martin retains his true self. He doesn't harm the guard dog, and later on he doesn't harm Beth either. So this Fly hybrid is clearly more of an anti-hero. And when he's unleashed, this turns into a creature feature mashed together with a revenge movie. Keep in mind, everyone Martin goes after are Bartok's minions. These are people who have had Martin on lockdown. They've lied to him, manipulated him, and they've even been watching him in secret. So these people are creeps, and that brings us to the gory parts I mentioned earlier. Some of Bartok's security get it a lot worse than others. One guard gets his entire face melted off, and another guard has his head squashed like a grape in an elevator shaft. There's no cutting away in either scene, it's all explicitly shown. Supposedly, the head crushing scene originally earned this movie an X rating, but the director appealed the decision and the movie was able to skate by with an R rating. The director Chris Wallace also noted that this movie could have been a lot more gory, but in his view this was just a monster movie. He wanted to sell the story first and foremost. By only having 2 over-the-top graphic scenes, the story wasn't overshadowed by a marathon of blood and guts. Now, remember that whole gene swapping idea from earlier? Well, it does get some payoff too, because who better than Mr. Bartok to use as a donor? Martin gets a hold of his former father figure and forces him to type in the secret password, which is Dad. Ah. With the machine unlocked, Martin drags Mr. Bartok into a telepod, he has Beth activate the gene swapping sequence, and that's that. When Martin and Bartok exit the telepod, Martin is restored to human form, but Anton is now a hideous monstrosity. This is yet another huge difference between Cronenberg's movie and the sequel. The expectation may have been that the sequel would also end on a completely tragic note, but instead we get a happy, slimy ending for our protagonists. It's obviously not a happy ending for Mr. Bartok. He receives a brutal punishment. Anton is now a monster, and he ends up in the same cage as Martin's dog. As he begins to eat slop from a dish, a housefly buzzes by to greet him. I have to admit, this is easily one of the most memorable endings to a horror movie I've ever seen. Now, if I were to just sit here and compare the sequel to the original, it probably wouldn't hold up in many areas, so it's best to just take this movie on its own merits and enjoy it for what it is. As I noted, there's a solid enough story here, and there's some great practical effects. Chris Wallace and his team of artists outdid themselves. And watching this years later, I found it to be a fun enough ride overall. The movie is paced pretty well, there's some good scares, we get some memorable horror moments sprinkled throughout, and I never felt like it disrespected Cronenberg's vision in any way. Wallace was clearly aiming for more of a throwback to older monster movies, and I think he achieved that. There's a good amount of trivia as far as this movie goes, so I did want to run through at least some of it. Now, in the opening of this movie, it's implied something shady has already gone down involving Bartok Industries. Veronica yells that she's been lied to, and later we see Martin simply adopted by Anton. Now, this all goes by so fast on a first viewing you may not consider it, but it felt like there was a prologue that belonged here. I poked around online and learned that an early treatment written by Tim Lucas apparently did feature Veronica dealing with the Bartok company. It was a lot more clear that Bartok Industries was evil as hell. Seth Brundle's consciousness somehow survived within the telepod computer, but the scientists at Bartok had enslaved him and were actually using him to develop cloning, which would have been an insane story. And also of note, the preferred title of this movie by the director Chris Wallace would have been The Son of the Fly. But back in this era, meaning the late 80s, movie sequels almost always had numbers attached to their titles. However, one of the trailers for this movie did pay homage to the original franchise.
Listen. Do you hear it?
Listen. Do you hear? It's coming back.
Also, on a couple of occasions, the guard Scorby calls Martin Marty. Now, I'm not sure if this is just a coincidence or maybe an Easter egg relating to Eric Stoltz. As most of us know, Eric Stoltz was originally cast as Marty McFly in Back to the Future before being replaced by Michael J. Fox. The last bit of trivia I wanted to mention relates to what became of this series. I actually would have loved seeing a third movie, making this a trilogy. Over the years there's been talks of reboots and sequels, and Jeff Goldblum has even mentioned he'd love to return to the franchise in some way. However, if you really are curious what a Fly 3 might have looked like, then check out the 2015 5-issue miniseries from IDW called The Fly Outbreak. This book was written by Brendan Seifert and featured stellar artwork by Menton Matthews III. In this story, the Brundle family legacy continues, and we pick up right where The Fly 2 left off. For all you fellow comic book fans out there, this may be one worth checking out. That's about it for me. As far as ratings go, I'd give The Fly 2 3.5 mutated fly heads out of 5. If you've seen the Fly sequel, feel free to let me know your thoughts about it in the comment section below. And don't forget, hit like and sub if you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, be well, stay safe, later.